Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching from tonight. And please do not forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Your support means everything, and it helps bring more of these stories to life. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you somewhere unexpected tonight. We are going to a place that exists only in memory now. A California valley that smelled of apricot blossoms in the spring and prune orchards in the summer. A place where the biggest decisions of the day might have been which fruit to pick or which country road to take home. This was the Santa Clara Valley in the years after World War II, and if you had driven through it in 1955 or 1960, you would have seen nothing to suggest that this quiet agricultural paradise was about to birth an industry that would reshape human civilization. But beneath the surface of those peaceful orchards, something remarkable was stirring. In university laboratories and cramped workshops, in the minds of young engineers fresh from graduate school, ideas were forming that would eventually put a computer in your pocket and connect every human being on the planet. Tonight we are going to explore how that happened. We are going to meet the rebels and the visionaries, the betrayers and the dreamers. We are going to witness rivalries that split friendships and partnerships that created empires. And we are going to see how a handful of decisions made in garages and hotel bars during the 1960s and 1970s set the course for the world you and I live in today. So close your eyes if you like, and let the story carry you back to a time before smartphones, before the internet, before anyone could have imagined what was coming. The Santa Clara Valley earned its nickname honestly. They called it the Valley of Heart's Delight, and for good reason. In the early decades of the 20th century, this stretch of land south of San Francisco Bay was considered one of the most beautiful agricultural regions in America. Cherry trees, apricot orchards, walnut groves, and seemingly endless fields of prunes covered the valley floor. The climate was perfect, mild and Mediterranean, with just enough rainfall to keep the soil rich and the harvests abundant. Families had farmed this land for generations, and the rhythm of life followed the seasons in a way that felt timeless. But even in this bucolic setting, the seeds of change had been planted long before anyone recognized them. Stanford University sat at the northern edge of the valley, and within its engineering department, a quiet revolution was taking shape. The man most responsible for this transformation was Frederick Terman, a professor whose influence would echo through decades of technological development. Terman had a vision that seemed almost radical at the time. He believed that Stanford's brightest graduates should not scatter across the country to work for established East Coast companies. Instead, he argued, they should stay right here in California and build something new. This was not a small ask. In the 1930s and 1940s, the conventional path for ambitious engineers led to places like New York or Boston, where the major industrial companies had their headquarters. California was considered something of a backwater in the world of serious technology. But Terman saw something others missed. He saw the potential for a self-sustaining ecosystem where universities, businesses, and investors could feed off each other's energy. He saw the possibility of a new kind of American industry rising from the California soil. Terman began encouraging his best students to resist the pull of the East Coast. He helped them find funding. He connected them with each other. And slowly a community of like-minded engineers and entrepreneurs began to take root in the shadow of the Stanford campus. Two of Terman's most promising students were Bill Hewlett and David Packard, young men who had become friends during their undergraduate years and shared a passion for electronics. After graduation, they went their separate ways for a time, with Packard taking the job at General Electric in New York. But Terman stayed in touch, encouraging them to consider starting a company of their own back in California. In 1938, David Packard returned to Palo Alto with his new bride Lucille, and they rented a modest house at 367 Addison Avenue. The property had a small one-car garage in the back, and it was there that Packard and his friend Bill Hewlett began tinkering with electronics in their spare time. Bill actually lived in a tiny shed next to the garage, paying rent that came to little more than a few dollars a month. The two young engineers worked with almost nothing. They had scraped together $538 between them, barely enough to buy basic tools and components. They experimented with various products, including a device that used electrical currents to activate muscles and an indicator for bowling alley foul lines. Nothing quite clicked until they developed an audio oscillator based on research Hewlett had done at Stanford. On January 1, 1939, Hewlett-Packard formalized their partnership with a coin flip to determine whose name would come first. Hewlett won, and the Hewlett-Packard Company was officially born. Their audio oscillator, designated the Model 200A to make the company seem more established than it was, found an unexpected customer in Walt Disney Studios, which purchased 8 units for use in producing the animated film Fantasia. The little garage on Addison Avenue would later be designated a California historical landmark and given a bronze plaque identifying it as the birthplace of Silicon Valley. That honorific captures something important about the mythology of the region. From the very beginning, Silicon Valley celebrated the garage as a symbol of possibility, proof that transformative companies could emerge from the humblest circumstances. The pace of change accelerated dramatically after World War II, and the reason was money. Enormous amounts of government money began flowing into California as the Cold War heated up. The Soviet Union had become America's great rival, and suddenly the federal government was willing to spend almost unlimited sums on any technology that might provide a military advantage. Radar systems, missile guidance computers, satellite communications, all of these required sophisticated electronics, and California was positioned to provide them. The establishment of NASA and the Advanced Research Projects Agency, which would later be known as DARPA, opened the floodgates even wider. By the early 1960s, these agencies were funding more than 70% of all computer technology research in the United States. Any company that could demonstrate useful capabilities found itself showered with contracts. Laboratories that had operated on shoestring budgets suddenly had resources beyond their wildest dreams. This influx of military and aerospace spending transformed the Santa Clara Valley in ways that were not immediately visible to the casual observer. Yes, the orchards still bloomed in spring. Yes, families still gathered for harvest festivals in the fall. But scattered among the fruit trees, a new kind of establishment was taking root. Small electronics firms occupied modest buildings on quiet streets. University researchers collaborated with industry partners on classified projects. The infrastructure for an entirely new economy was being assembled piece by piece, though almost no one yet understood what it would become. Into this environment came a man whose name would become synonymous with both genius and failure. William Shockley was one of the most brilliant physicists of his generation. While working at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, he had played a central role in the invention of the transistor, the tiny electronic switch that would eventually replace the bulky vacuum tubes powering early computers. This achievement earned Shockley a share of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1956, cementing his reputation as one of the great scientific minds of the 20th century. But Shockley wanted more than academic recognition. He wanted to build an empire. In 1956, he returned to his hometown of Palo Alto, California, and established the Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory. His goal was to develop and manufacture a new generation of semiconductor devices that would revolutionize the electronics industry. To staff his new venture, Shockley recruited some of the most talented young engineers and physicists in America. He had an extraordinary eye for talent, and the team he assembled represented the cream of the crop from universities across the country. On paper, Shockley Semiconductor should have dominated the emerging semiconductor industry. It had a Nobel Prize-winning founder with unmatched technical credentials. It had access to abundant government funding. It was located in a region that was rapidly becoming a center for electronics research. And it had assembled a team of young geniuses who would later prove themselves capable of changing the world. But there was a problem, and his name was William Shockley. For all his scientific brilliance, Shockley proved to be a disastrous manager. He was secretive, paranoid and authoritarian. He micromanaged his employees while simultaneously refusing to share information they needed to do their jobs effectively. He made decisions based on whims and hunches rather than careful analysis. And he had a talent for making the people around him feel small and unappreciated. The young engineers Shockley had recruited were not the type to suffer in silence. They were ambitious, confident, and increasingly frustrated. They had come to California expecting to work at the cutting edge of technology, and instead they found themselves trapped in a dysfunctional organization led by a man who seemed determined to squander every opportunity. By the spring of 1957, the situation had become intolerable. A group of 8 employees began meeting secretly to discuss their options. They talked about approaching the company's board of directors and demanding that Shockley be replaced. They talked about trying to find positions at other companies. They talked about simply giving up and returning to the academic careers they had left behind. And then someone suggested something that seemed almost crazy at the time. What if they started their own company? This was not the kind of thing that people did in 1957. The idea of simply walking away from a job and starting a competing business felt reckless, perhaps even unethical. These young men had signed non-compete agreements. They had learned proprietary techniques at Shockley's laboratory. Some of them had families to support. The safe thing to do was to keep their heads down and hope that the situation improved. But the 8 engineers who gathered in secret that spring were not interested in playing it safe. They were tired of watching their best ideas languish under Shockley's erratic leadership. They were tired of being treated like children by a man who, for all his genius, seemed incapable of building a functioning organization. They wanted to prove that they could do better. The group began searching for financial backing. They wrote letters to major corporations across the country trying to find someone willing to invest in their vision. Most of their inquiries went nowhere. The idea of funding a group of young engineers with no track record and no product seemed too risky for most established companies. Then a connection emerged that would change everything. Eugene Kleiner, one of the 8 engineers, had a father who knew someone at a New York investment bank called Hayden Stone. A young banker there named Arthur Rock agreed to meet with the group and hear their pitch. Rock was intrigued. He saw something special in these 8 young men, something that went beyond their technical credentials. He saw hunger and determination. He saw a willingness to take risks that more established engineers would never consider, and he saw an opportunity to be part of something potentially transformative. Rock began working his contacts in the New York financial community, trying to find someone willing to back the venture. It was not easy. Most of the businessmen he approached could not understand why anyone would want to start a company in California to make obscure electronic components. But Rock persisted, and eventually he found a willing partner in Sherman Fairchild. Sherman Fairchild was an unusual figure in the American business world. He was an inventor and entrepreneur who had made fortunes in aviation and photography. He was also something of a playboy, known for his lavish lifestyle and his friendship with other wealthy eccentrics like Howard Hughes. But beneath the glamorous exterior, Fairchild had a genuine appreciation for technological innovation. When Rock explained what the 8 engineers were trying to accomplish, Fairchild saw the potential. The deal came together quickly. On September 18, 1957, the 8 engineers resigned from Shockley Semiconductor and formed a new company called Fairchild Semiconductor. Each of them had contributed $100 of their own money to the venture, a symbolic gesture that represented their personal commitment to the enterprise. Sherman Fairchild provided a loan of over $1 million to get operations started. There is a famous story about how the partnership was formalized. The 8 founders met at the bar of the Clift Hotel in San Francisco, a grand old establishment that had been hosting business deals since the early 1900s. They had no formal partnership documents, no legal agreements, nothing but their shared determination to build something great. So they did something unconventional. They pulled out $1 bill, and each of them signed it 10 times, creating a makeshift contract that represented their mutual commitment. When William Shockley learned what had happened, he was furious. He felt betrayed by the men he had recruited and trained. He threatened lawsuits. He called them traitors. The nickname stuck, and the 8 engineers became known in Silicon Valley lore as the Traitorous Eight. It was meant as an insult, but over time it became a badge of honor. The Traitorous Eight set up their new laboratory at 844 East Charleston Road in Mountain View, California. This was just 12 blocks from Shockley's facility, a geographical proximity that must have added salt to the wound. Every day, Shockley could look out his window knowing that his former employees were working just down the street to prove that they could succeed where he had failed. The founding team included Robert Noyce, who would provide charismatic leadership and eventually co-invent the integrated circuit. Gordon Moore would later articulate the famous prediction about transistor density that became known as Moore's Law. Julius Blank, Victor Greenwich, Gene Horney, Eugene Kleiner, Jay Last, and Sheldon Roberts rounded out the group, each bringing specialized expertise that would prove essential to the company's success. What happened next exceeded even the founders' most optimistic projections. Fairchild Semiconductor grew explosively. Within 3 years, the company had developed revolutionary manufacturing processes that made their products cheaper and more reliable than anything their competitors could offer. Their silicon transistors became essential components in everything from military guidance systems to the computers that would eventually send American astronauts to the moon. By the mid-1960s, Fairchild Semiconductor had grown from a dozen employees to more than 12,000. Their annual revenues had soared to over $130 million. They were the undisputed leaders of the semiconductor industry, setting the pace for technological innovation that their competitors struggled to match. But success brought its own problems. The same entrepreneurial spirit that had driven the 8 founders to leave Shockley was now driving their own employees to seek greener pastures. Talented engineers would spend a few years at Fairchild, learn everything they could, and then leave to start their own companies. The pattern repeated so often that these spin-off ventures became known collectively as the Fairchildren, a sprawling family tree of semiconductor companies that could all trace their lineage back to the original 8 founders. The mobility was accelerated by a peculiarity of California law that would prove crucial to Silicon Valley's development. Unlike most other states, California did not enforce non-compete agreements. An engineer who left one company to join or start a competitor could not be sued for violating a contract that restricted their employment options. This meant that ideas and expertise flowed freely through the valley, cross-pollinating between companies in ways that would have been impossible in more legally restrictive environments. The culture that emerged from this constant churning of talent and ideas was unlike anything else in American business. People changed jobs frequently, but they did not become enemies when they left. Former colleagues who now worked for competing firms would meet for drinks and share information that would have been considered proprietary in other industries. There was a sense that everyone was working toward a common goal, even if they were technically rivals. Tensions eventually developed within the original founding team as well. Jean Horny had developed a revolutionary planar process that made transistors far more reliable, but he felt that Gordon Moore was not giving him adequate credit for the innovation. Jay Last wanted to push forward with developing integrated circuits, but found himself blocked by executives who thought the project was too risky. One by one, members of the original 8 began drifting away to pursue other opportunities. Eugene Kleiner left to try something entirely different. Rather than starting another semiconductor company, he partnered with Tom Perkins to form a venture capital firm. Kleiner Perkins would become one of the most influential investment partnerships in Silicon Valley history, funding generations of technology startups and pioneering new models for backing risky entrepreneurial ventures. But the most consequential departure came in 1968, when Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore decided they had had enough of working within the Fairchild corporate structure. The semiconductor division had made the parent company extremely profitable, But the executives back east seemed more interested in extracting cash from the business than reinvesting in new research and development. Noyce had been passed over for the chief executive position despite his obvious qualifications, and both he and Moore were frustrated by decisions being made by people who did not understand the technology. The story of their departure has become part of Silicon Valley folklore. On a sunny California day in May 1968, Gordon Moore stopped by Robert Noyce's house. Noyce was out front mowing his lawn, and the two men fell into conversation about the state of the semiconductor industry and their growing dissatisfaction with Fairchild. By the time Moore went home that evening, they had decided to start a new company together. They had no detailed business plan, no specific product in mind, nothing but their reputations and their conviction that they could build something better. When Arthur Rock, the same banker who had helped arrange the original Fairchild deal 11 years earlier, heard what they were planning, he did not ask for extensive documentation. He simply started making phone calls to potential investors. The fundraising took less than 2 days. Noyce and Moore raised $2.5 million from a small group of wealthy individuals who trusted them based on their track records. No formal business plan was ever presented. The money came in on faith, a testament to how much credibility the two men had built through their years of successful innovation. Choosing a name for the new company proved surprisingly difficult. They initially registered as NM Electronics, using their initials, but that seemed too bland for a company with such ambitious goals. Someone suggested combining parts of the words integrated and electronics, which produced Intel. It had a certain ring to it, suggesting intelligence and sophistication. The only problem was that a hotel chain in the Midwest had already registered a similar name. Noyce and Moore decided that paying $15,000 to acquire the trademark was easier than trying to think of another option. It was a characteristically pragmatic decision that reflected their engineering mindset: solve the problem with whatever resources are available and move on to the next challenge. Intel began operations on August 1, 1968, with about a dozen employees working out of a conference room in a modest office building. Gordon Moore later recalled being somewhat embarrassed that their facility was larger than they actually needed. That concern would not last long. Almost immediately, Robert Noyce recruited a former colleague from Fairchild named Andrew Grove to join the new venture. Grove was a Hungarian immigrant who had fled his homeland during the 1956 uprising and made his way to America with little money and limited English skills. Through extraordinary determination, he had earned a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of California at Berkeley and built a reputation as one of the most capable process engineers in the semiconductor industry. Grove brought something to Intel that complemented the strengths of Noyce and Moore perfectly. Where Noyce was the visionary and natural leader, the man who could inspire loyalty and articulate grand ambitions, and Moore was the technical genius who understood the science at a fundamental level, Grove was the disciplined manager who could translate ideas into operational reality. He would later be credited with turning Intel from a promising startup into one of the most successful companies in technology history. The three men established a corporate culture that was deliberately different from the formal hierarchies that dominated most American businesses at the time. There were no reserved parking spaces for executives, no fancy corner offices, no obvious markers of status that separated the leaders from everyone else. Noyce shunned the trappings of corporate power, preferring to work alongside his employees rather than above them. This egalitarian approach became part of Intel's identity and influenced countless other Silicon Valley companies in the decades that followed. Intel's original business plan focused on semiconductor memory chips, devices that could store digital information far more efficiently than the magnetic core memory that computers had previously used. The company's first product, released in 1969, was a static, random access memory chip that established Intel as a serious competitor in the market. But the innovation that would truly transform the company and the world emerged almost by accident. In 1969, a Japanese calculator manufacturer called Busicom approached Intel with a request to design a set of chips for a new line of calculators. The original plan called for 12 different custom chips, each designed to perform a specific function. An Intel engineer named Ted Hoff proposed a radical alternative. Instead of designing 12 separate chips, why not create a single general-purpose chip that could be programmed to perform any of the required functions? This would be simpler to manufacture and more flexible in application. The result was the Intel 4004, released in 1971, which is generally considered the world's first commercially available microprocessor. The microprocessor was one of those innovations whose significance was not immediately apparent even to the people who created it. Intel initially saw it mainly as a way to simplify their manufacturing process and satisfy a single customer's needs. They did not immediately recognize that they had invented a device that would eventually make personal computers possible, that would shrink room-sized machines to something that could fit in your pocket, that would fundamentally alter how human beings work and communicate and live. In 1965, while still at Fairchild, Gordon Moore had published an article making a prediction that would prove remarkably accurate. He observed that the number of transistors that could be placed on an integrated circuit was doubling approximately every year. This rate of progress, he suggested, would likely continue into the foreseeable future. Moore later revised the doubling time to every 2 years, and this prediction became known as Moore's Law. Moore's Law was not really a law of nature like gravity or thermodynamics. It was more like a self-fulfilling prophecy, a goal that the semiconductor industry collectively agreed to pursue. Engineers and executives used Moore's Law as a roadmap, planning their research and development investments around the assumption that performance would continue to double on a predictable schedule. The expectation became reality, because everyone in the industry was working to make it so. The implications of this exponential growth were profound, but hard to grasp intuitively. If computing power doubles every 2 years, then over the course of a decade, it increases by a factor of about 32. Over 20 years, the increase is more than 1,000-fold. Over 50 years, the improvement is measured in millions. Technologies that seemed impossibly expensive and complex in one generation became cheap and commonplace in the next. But before we explore those later developments, we need to step back and look at another force that was shaping Silicon Valley during these crucial years. The technological revolution emerging from the valley was not happening in isolation. It was deeply intertwined with the broader cultural upheavals sweeping through America during the 1960s and 1970s. The San Francisco Bay Area had become the epicenter of the counterculture movement. Just a few miles north of the semiconductor laboratories in Mountain View and Palo Alto, young people were gathering in the Haight-Ashbury district to experiment with new ways of living and thinking. The Vietnam War had sparked massive protests that challenged the authority of government and traditional institutions. A generation was questioning everything their parents had taken for granted. This might seem disconnected from the world of transistors and integrated circuits, but the connections were real and important. Many of the engineers working in Silicon Valley had come of age during these turbulent times. They had absorbed the counterculture's suspicion of large institutions and its emphasis on individual empowerment. They had learned to question conventional wisdom and challenge established hierarchies, and many of them had developed a conviction that technology should serve ordinary people, not just governments and corporations. One of the key figures who bridged the gap between the counterculture and the technology world was Stewart Brand. In 1968, Brand published the first edition of the Whole Earth Catalog, a sprawling compendium of tools, books, and ideas that became a kind of Bible for the Back to the Land movement. The catalog's subtitle was Access to Tools, and its underlying philosophy was that ordinary people should have the knowledge and resources to shape their own lives rather than depending on large institutions to provide for them. Brand had an intuition that computers would eventually become tools for individual empowerment, even though the machines of that era were massive, expensive, and accessible only to large organizations. He visited laboratories and research centers where engineers were working on ideas that might someday make computing more personal and democratic. He publicized their work and helped create a sense that technology and counterculture values were not opposed but could actually reinforce each other. Another crucial figure was Douglas Engelbart, a researcher at the Stanford Research Institute who had been thinking about human-computer interaction since the early 1960s. Engelbart believed that computers could be used to augment human intelligence, helping people think more clearly, collaborate more effectively, and solve problems that would be impossible for individuals working alone. In December 1968, Engelbart gave a demonstration at a computer conference in San Francisco that has since become known as the mother of all demos. Over the course of 90 minutes, he showed the assembled researchers a series of innovations that would not become mainstream for another 2 decades. He used a mouse to control a cursor on a screen. He demonstrated hypertext links that allowed jumping between related pieces of information. He showed video conferencing between his presentation location and his laboratory 30 miles away. He displayed windows that could show multiple documents simultaneously. The audience was stunned. Many of them had been working on computers for years, but they had never imagined that the machines could be used in this way. Engelbart was showing them a future in which computers were not just calculation devices for scientists and accountants, but tools for thinking and communicating that anyone might use. Engelbart's ideas would take years to percolate through the technology industry, but they planted seeds that would eventually flower in the personal computer revolution. Some of his researchers would later join a new laboratory that Xerox was establishing in Palo Alto, carrying his insights about human-computer interaction to a place where they would find new expression. Xerox, the company that had made its fortune selling photocopiers and office equipment, made a bold and somewhat puzzling decision in 1970. They established a new research facility called the Palo Alto Research Center, known by its acronym PARC, and gave its scientists extraordinary freedom to pursue whatever ideas they found most promising. The goal was to invent the technologies that would define the office of the future, though the company's leadership had only vague notions of what that might actually look like. The scientists and engineers who gathered at PARC in the early 1970s found themselves in something like researcher heaven. They had generous budgets, access to cutting-edge equipment, and almost complete autonomy to pursue their interests. The atmosphere was electric with intellectual energy. Ideas that would have been dismissed as impractical elsewhere were taken seriously and explored thoroughly. One of the researchers who would later co-found Adobe described the environment at PARC as unlike anything he had experienced before or since. There was total intellectual freedom, he recalled. Almost every idea was up for challenge and got challenged regularly. People argued passionately about technical approaches and design philosophies, but the arguments were productive rather than destructive. Everyone was pushing toward the same general goal of making computers more useful and more accessible. Within a remarkably short time, the PARC team had invented or significantly advanced an astonishing array of technologies. They developed the graphical user interface, the visual system of Windows icons and menus that would eventually become the standard way for humans to interact with computers. They refined the computer mouse that Engelbart had pioneered, making it more practical for everyday use. They created Ethernet, the networking technology that allows computers to communicate with each other. They developed the laser printer, which would revolutionize document production. They designed what was arguably the first true personal computer, a machine called the Alto that incorporated all of these innovations into a single integrated system. The Alto was extraordinary. Unlike the mainframes and minicomputers that dominated computing at the time, it was designed to be used by a single person sitting at a desk. Its display could show text and graphics rather than just characters. Its user interface was visual and intuitive, rather than requiring memorized commands typed on a keyboard. It could connect to other computers over a local network, allowing people to share files and send electronic messages. If you had walked into Xerox PARC in 1975 and sat down at an Alto, you would have had an experience remarkably similar to using a personal computer today. You would have moved a mouse to position a cursor on the screen. You would have clicked on icons to open programs. You would have looked at documents displayed exactly as they would appear when printed. It was computing as we know it now, implemented years before most people had any idea such things were possible. But there was a profound disconnect between what was happening at PARC and what was happening at Xerox corporate headquarters 3,000 miles away in Rochester, New York. The executives who ran the company were focused on the photocopy business that had made Xerox wealthy and powerful. They understood paper and toner and service contracts. They did not understand, and did not particularly want to understand, the strange machines their California researchers were building. When PARC scientists tried to explain the potential of their inventions, they were met with skepticism or indifference. The Alto was too expensive to manufacture in large quantities. The graphical interface was too different from what people were used to. The networking technology solved problems that most businesses did not know they had. Again and again, promising innovations were shelved or pursued only half-heartedly. The researchers grew increasingly frustrated. They had created technologies that could transform how people work and communicate, and they were watching their inventions gather dust in a corporate culture that could not see their value. Many of them began leaving PARC to start their own companies, or join the growing constellation of technology firms in Silicon Valley. The brain drain was gradual but relentless. Meanwhile, a very different kind of computer enthusiasm was taking root in the garages and living rooms of the Bay Area. While PARC researchers worked with advanced equipment funded by corporate budgets, a community of hobbyists and tinkerers was exploring the same questions with whatever resources they could scrape together. The spark that ignited this movement came in January 1975, when Popular Electronics magazine published a cover story about a device called the Altair 8000. The Altair was a kit computer, a collection of parts that buyers could assemble themselves to create a functioning machine. By the standards of the time, it was incredibly affordable, costing only a few $100s compared to the tens of thousands that even the cheapest commercial computers demanded. The Altair was also, it must be said, almost completely useless in any practical sense. When you finished assembling it, you had a box with blinking lights that could perform basic calculations if you painstakingly entered programs by flipping switches. There was no keyboard, no screen, no way to store information permanently. But none of that mattered to the enthusiasts who sent in their orders by the thousands. What the Altair represented was possibility. Here was a computer that an individual could own, could understand, could modify and improve. It was the first crack in the wall that had kept computing locked away in air-conditioned rooms tended by credentialed professionals. For the hobbyists who gathered around this crude machine, it represented a new kind of freedom. One of the gathering points for these enthusiasts was a group that called itself the Homebrew Computer Club. The first meeting took place on March 5, 1975, in the garage of Gordon French, an engineer who lived in Menlo Park, California. About 30 people showed up to look at an Altair and share their excitement about what personal computing might become. The club's ethos was captured in a phrase that appeared in their newsletter: "Give to help others." This was not a business networking group or a professional association. It was a community of people who believed that knowledge should be shared freely, that helping your neighbor figure out a technical problem was more important than protecting proprietary advantages. The spirit was cooperative and generous, almost utopian in its idealism. Meetings soon outgrew French's garage and moved to larger venues, eventually settling in an auditorium at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. The format remained informal. Each gathering began with a mapping period when members could stand up and share news, ask questions, or announce projects they were working on. This was followed by smaller discussions where people with similar interests would cluster together to work through specific problems. After the official meetings ended, many participants would reconvene in the parking lot of a nearby Safeway grocery store for impromptu swap meets, They traded components, exchanged homemade circuit boards, and continued the conversations that the formal meetings had started. Others drifted to a bar and grill called the Oasis, where the discussions would continue over beers late into the night. The cast of characters who passed through the Homebrew Computer Club reads like a who's who of personal computing history. Lee Felsenstein, who would later design the Osborne one of the first portable computers, served as the club's moderator. Adam Osborne, founder of the Osborne Computer Company, was a regular attendee. Jerry Lawson, who would create the first video game system to use interchangeable cartridges, participated in the discussions. Dozens of other members would go on to found companies or make significant contributions to the emerging personal computer industry. Among the regular attendees were two young men whose partnership would change the world. Steve Wozniak was an engineer at Hewlett-Packard by day, but his true passion was designing computers. He would sit in the back of homebrew meetings, absorbing information and thinking about how to build something better than anything that had come before. His friend Steve Jobs attended less frequently, and when he did show up, his interests seemed different from those of the other members. Wozniak was in it for the pure joy of engineering. He wanted to solve technical problems and create elegant designs that would earn the respect of his fellow hobbyists. Jobs was watching for something else entirely. Where Wozniak saw circuits and logic gates, Jobs saw opportunity. Where the other club members dreamed of building interesting machines, Jobs dreamed of building a business. The two Steves had known each other since the late 1960s, introduced by a mutual friend named Bill Fernandez. Despite their different temperaments, they connected immediately. Both were interested in electronics. Both had a rebellious streak that set them apart from more conventional young men their age, and both were willing to take risks that others would have considered foolish. Before computers entered the picture, Jobs and Wozniak had collaborated on a venture that was technically illegal. They built and sold devices called blue boxes that allowed users to make long-distance telephone calls without paying. The blue boxes exploited vulnerabilities in the telephone network to route calls for free, a practice that the phone company very much did not appreciate. Jobs handled the sales while Wozniak handled the engineering, a division of labor that would carry forward into their later partnership. The blue box experience taught Jobs an important lesson. He saw that a small device built in a garage could give ordinary people powers that had previously belonged only to large corporations. The telephone network was controlled by one of the biggest companies in America, but two kids working with a few dollars worth of electronics could bend that network to their will. If that was possible with telephones, what might be possible with computers? Wozniak had been dreaming about building his own computer for years, but the components were too expensive for someone of modest means. The processors used in machines like the Altair cost nearly $200 each, more than he could justify spending on a hobby project. Then in 1976, a small company called MOS Technology released a new processor chip called the 6502 for just $25. Suddenly, Wozniak's dream became affordable. He set to work designing a computer that would be more capable and elegant than anything the hobbyist community had yet seen. Where other homebrew designs required users to enter programs by flipping switches, Wozniak's machine would have a keyboard for input. Where other designs displayed output through blinking lights, his would connect to a television screen and show actual text and eventually graphics. And where other designs required expert knowledge to assemble, his would come as a complete circuit board that almost anyone could get running. Wozniak demonstrated his creation at a homebrew meeting in July 1976, and the reaction was everything he could have hoped for. The other members crowded around to examine his elegant design, marveling at how few chips he had used compared to other machines of similar capability. In the hobbyist community, using fewer components to accomplish the same task was considered a mark of engineering excellence, and Wozniak had proven himself a master. But it was Steve Jobs who grasped the commercial potential of what Wozniak had built. He saw immediately that this was not just an interesting project for hobbyists to admire. This was a product that could be sold to ordinary people who wanted to own a computer but lacked the technical skills to build one themselves. Jobs began pressing Wozniak to start a company with him. Wozniak was initially reluctant. He had a good job at Hewlett-Packard, a company he genuinely admired. His instinct was to share his designs freely with the hobbyist community rather than trying to profit from them. He had even offered his design to HP, but the company rejected it 5 times, unable to see how a personal computer fit into their business strategy. Eventually, Jobs convinced him that starting a company together would be worth trying, if only so they could tell their grandchildren someday that they had done it. To raise the capital needed to build their first batch of products, the two partners sold their most valuable possessions. Jobs sold his Volkswagen van for $1,500. Wozniak sold his beloved HP 65 scientific calculator for $500. With about $2,000 in total, they began operations in the garage of Jobs' parents' house in Los Altos, California. The garage on Chris Drive joined the earlier HP garage on Addison Avenue in the mythology of Silicon Valley founding locations. Here was proof that world-changing companies could emerge from the humblest circumstances. The two young men with big dreams and limited resources could build something that would rival the established giants of American industry. Jobs took charge of finding customers. He approached Paul Terrell, the owner of a computer store called the Byte Shop, and made a pitch that was part vision and part bluff. Terrell was a member of the Homebrew Computer Club himself and had seen Wozniak demonstrate the machine. He agreed to place an order for 50 computers, but he wanted them fully assembled, not as bare circuit boards. Jobs accepted the order without mentioning that he had no idea how to fulfill it. The next few weeks were frantic. Jobs negotiated 30-day credit terms with an electronics distributor, essentially promising to pay for components after he had sold the finished products. He recruited friends and family members to help assemble the machines. Wozniak worked around the clock to debug the design and test each completed unit. By sheer force of will, they delivered the order on time. Terrell was surprised when the computers arrived. He had expected complete systems with cases, monitors, and keyboards. What Jobs delivered were bare circuit boards that still required significant additional work before customers could use them. But a deal was a deal, and Terrell paid what he had promised. The price Jobs set for their creation was $666.66, a number that would later cause some consternation among superstitious customers who associated it with demonic symbolism. Wozniak claimed the pricing was simply because he liked repeating digits and that he had calculated a roughly 1/3 markup from their wholesale cost without any thought to numerological implications. They called their creation the Apple computer, and on April 1, 1976, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and a third partner named Ronald Wayne formally established the Apple Computer Company. Wayne, who was older and more cautious than his young partners, sold his stake in the company just 12 days later for $800. Had he held on, his share would eventually have been worth billions. Jobs had suggested the name Apple, and when no one came up with anything better within a few days, it stuck. Years later, he would explain that the name evoked something friendly and approachable, nothing like the cold corporate names that dominated the technology industry. Apples were wholesome and familiar. They were what teachers kept on their desks. They were California orchards, the same orchards that had once filled the Santa Clara Valley before the semiconductor factories moved in. The Apple I was a modest success. They sold about 200 units over the course of a year, enough to prove that there was a market for personal computers, but not enough to make anyone wealthy. Jobs and Wozniak were still working out of the garage, still scrambling to fill orders, still operating on a shoestring budget. But even as they struggled to build their small business, they were already thinking about what would come next. Wozniak was designing a far more capable machine that would include color graphics, sound, and built-in memory for storing programs. Jobs was thinking about how to make the new computer appeal to people who had no background in electronics, people who might never attend a homebrew meeting, but who could still benefit from owning a personal computer. They were going to need more money than they could raise by selling possessions. They were going to need professional help with manufacturing and marketing and all the other aspects of running a real company. They were going to need what the technology industry was learning to call adult supervision. The person who would provide that supervision appeared almost by accident. Jobs had been trying to attract investment from venture capitalists, but most of them could not see past the informal operation being run out of a garage by a couple of 20-something founders. Banks were equally skeptical. The idea of lending money to build computers for ordinary people seemed absurd at the time. Jobs approached Nolan Bushnell, his former boss at the video game company Atari, asking for advice or an introduction to potential investors. Bushnell suggested he talk to Don Valentine, the founder of Sequoia Capital, one of the venture capital firms that had recently established itself on Sand Hill Road. Valentine visited the garage, took one look at the scruffy young men running the operation, and decided to pass. But he did suggest that Jobs meet with Mike Markula, a former Intel executive who might be interested in smaller investments. Markula visited the garage and spent hours talking with Jobs and Wozniak about their vision for personal computing. Unlike Valentine, Markula saw something that the professional investors had missed. He saw that these two young men were not just hobbyists playing with toys. They had genuine insight into what computers could become, and they had the determination to make their vision real. Markula invested $250,000 of his own money and helped secure an additional line of credit from Bank of America. In exchange, he took a 1/3 ownership stake in the newly incorporated Apple Computer Company and agreed to serve as chairman of the board. The partnership was formalized in January 1977, and Apple moved out of the garage into real office space. The Apple II launched later that year, and it was unlike anything the personal computer market had seen. It came in a sleek plastic case rather than the bare metal boxes that characterized other machines. It displayed color graphics on an ordinary television set. It could run software from cassette tapes and eventually from floppy disk drives. And it was marketed not to hobbyists and engineers, but to ordinary people who might want to balance their checkbooks or play games or teach their children about computing. The machine was a sensation. Sales doubled year after year as word spread about this new kind of computer that anyone could use. Businesses began discovering that the Apple II could run spreadsheet software that automated tedious financial calculations. Schools began purchasing machines for their computer labs. A category that had not existed a few years earlier was suddenly generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. Apple's success caught the attention of people throughout the technology industry, including some researchers at Xerox PARC who had been watching the personal computer revolution with mixed emotions. They had invented many of the technologies that made personal computing possible, but their corporate parent had shown no interest in bringing those technologies to market. Now they were watching outsiders profit from ideas that had originated in their laboratories. Some of the PARC researchers had already left to start their own ventures. Others remained at the lab, but had grown cynical about Xerox's ability to capitalize on innovation. When Steve Jobs began expressing interest in visiting PARC to see what they had developed, opinions were divided about whether to show him anything. The visit happened because of a business deal that seemed favorable to Xerox at the time. Apple was preparing for an initial public stock offering that would make the company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Xerox's corporate development group wanted a piece of that value, and Jobs was willing to give them a small stake in exchange for a look inside PARC. The terms were negotiated, and in late 1979, Jobs led a small delegation of Apple engineers to Palo Alto to see the future. There were actually 2 visits, with Jobs present on the second one. Jeff Raskin, an Apple engineer who was working on a project that would eventually become the Macintosh, had been trying to convince Jobs to see what Xerox was doing. Raskin had spent time at PARC during a sabbatical and knew about the remarkable technologies being developed there. He wanted Jobs to understand that the work Apple was doing was building on foundations that others had laid. The demonstration was conducted by Larry Tesler, a PARC researcher who had been working on making computers easier to use. He showed the visitors the Alto and its graphical interface. He moved a mouse across the desk and watched the cursor track smoothly across the screen. He clicked on icons and opened windows. He demonstrated a word processor that showed text exactly as it would appear when printed. He used the mouse to select text and move it around the document with ease. Jobs was mesmerized. He began pacing around the room, increasingly agitated, unable to sit still as the implications of what he was seeing sank in. According to witnesses, he started shouting at the demonstrators, demanding to know why Xerox was not doing anything with this technology. Did they not understand what they had? Did they not see that this was the future of computing? Years later, Jobs would describe the experience in almost religious terms. He said he was shown 3 things at PARC, but was so blinded by the first one that he did not fully appreciate the other 2. The first thing was the graphical user interface, the windows and icons and mouse-driven interaction that would become the standard way humans use computers. The second was object-oriented programming, a way of writing software that would become dominant in the industry. The third was networking, the ability of computers to communicate with each other. Of the 3, Jobs immediately understood only the first, but that was enough to change everything. The Apple engineers absorbed what they were seeing with the intensity of people who understood exactly how significant it was. Bill Atkinson, who would later create key graphics software for the Macintosh, moved so close to the screen that his nose was almost touching it, trying to understand how the display was being rendered. They asked detailed technical questions about the implementation, trying to learn as much as possible during their brief visit. Jobs returned to Apple transformed. He had seen the future, and he was determined to make that future happen even if Xerox would not. He immediately began redirecting company resources toward developing a graphical interface that would bring the PARC vision to a mass market. The Lisa project, which had been underway for some time, was refocused on incorporating graphical elements. A newer project called Macintosh would eventually carry the vision even further. The mouse was a particular focus of attention. The Xerox mouse was an engineering marvel, but it was expensive to manufacture and used 3 buttons that Jobs considered too complicated for ordinary users. He set Apple's engineers to work designing a simpler, cheaper alternative. Dean Hovey, a designer who would later help found the firm that became IDEO, got a phone call from Jobs just days after the PARC visit. Jobs was obsessed with the mouse and wanted Apple to build one that could be manufactured for a fraction of the Xerox device's cost. Hovey went to a local Walgreens and bought all the roll-on deodorant applicators he could find, intrigued by the way the balls moved smoothly in their sockets. He bought a butter dish to use as a shell. From these humble materials, he began prototyping what would become one of the most influential input devices in computing history. The mouse that emerged from Apple's development process had just 1 button rather than Xerox's 3. Jobs had insisted on simplification, arguing that learning to use a mouse was already challenging enough without adding multiple buttons to confuse new users. This decision was controversial, and critics argued for years that the single-button mouse was inferior to multi-button alternatives, but it reflected Jobs' conviction that the most important feature of any consumer product was making it simple enough for anyone to use. The irony of the Xerox PARC visit would become one of the most discussed episodes in technology history. Xerox had traded a small investment in Apple for the privilege of showing off technologies that Apple would then commercialize far more successfully than Xerox ever did. The investment stake that cost Xerox about $1 million was sold almost immediately for a modest profit, mere pocket change compared to the billions of dollars that the graphical interface would eventually generate for Apple and its competitors. Xerox did eventually release their own commercial products based on the PARC technologies, the Xerox Star, launched in 1981, was a sophisticated office workstation that incorporated graphical interfaces, networking, and laser printing. It was also extraordinarily expensive, costing around $16,000 for a single workstation and much more for a complete office system. At those prices, it found few buyers outside specialized corporate environments. Apple released the Lisa in January 1983, incorporating many of the ideas that had so excited Jobs at PARC. The Lisa was expensive too, priced at nearly $10,000, and it sold poorly. But the Macintosh that followed in January 1984, priced at around $2,500, brought the graphical interface to a much broader market. It was not an immediate blockbuster either, but it established a new paradigm for how humans interact with computers, one that persists to the present day. As the 1970s drew to a close, Silicon Valley had transformed beyond recognition. The orchards that had once defined the Santa Clara Valley had largely disappeared, replaced by office parks and industrial facilities. Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park had become the headquarters for dozens of venture capital firms, making it the financial center of the technology industry. The culture of the region had crystallized into something distinctive, a blend of engineering ambition, entrepreneurial risk-taking, and informal collaboration that existed nowhere else in America. The interconnections between the people and companies we have discussed were dense and complex. Robert Noyce of Intel had become a mentor to Steve Jobs. Mike Markula had worked at both Fairchild and Intel before joining Apple. Researchers moved from PARC to Apple and vice versa, carrying ideas and expertise with them. The venture capitalists who funded new startups often sat on the boards of multiple companies simultaneously, weaving a web of relationships that spanned the valley. This ecosystem had emerged not from careful planning, but from a combination of fortunate circumstances and individual choices. The presence of Stanford University provided a steady supply of technical talent and a culture that valued entrepreneurship. The defense and aerospace industries had seeded the region with money and expertise. California's legal environment made it easy for employees to leave established companies and start competitors. The Fairchild diaspora had demonstrated that departing employees should be viewed as alumni rather than traitors, creating a culture where job changing was not just accepted but celebrated. The physical landscape of the valley had changed, but something of the old character remained. Engineers still gathered in informal settings to share ideas and solve problems together. Startups still operated out of garages and spare bedrooms before graduating to proper offices. The ethos of the Homebrew Computer Club, the spirit of giving to help others, persisted even as the stakes grew larger and the money more abundant. And the people who had lived through this transformation carried with them the memory of what it had felt like to be present at the creation. They remembered when the valley was still filled with fruit trees. They remembered the excitement of seeing the first microprocessors emerge from the fabrication lines. They remembered the cramped meetings at the Homebrew Club and the late-night sessions in garages and laboratories. They remembered the moment when they first realized that computers might become tools for everyone, not just specialists in white lab coats. Those memories would sustain them through the decades of change that followed. The valley would continue to evolve, spawning new industries and new fortunes, attracting ambitious people from around the world who wanted to participate in the ongoing revolution. The personal computer would give way to the internet, which would give way to the smartphone, which would give way to whatever comes next. But the foundation had been laid in those remarkable years when a quiet agricultural valley transformed itself into the technological center of the world. The story we have explored tonight is not really about computers or semiconductors or venture capital. It is about people. People who were willing to take extraordinary risks in pursuit of their visions. People who built lifelong friendships and bitter rivalries in the course of their work. People who changed the world and, in the process, changed themselves. William Shockley, the brilliant and difficult man whose management failures inadvertently created the conditions for Silicon Valley's rise, spent his later years increasingly isolated from the industry he had helped create. His turn toward controversial theories made him a pariah among scientists who had once revered him. He died in 1989, largely estranged from his children and mostly forgotten by the technology community that owed so much to his early work. The Traitorous Eight went on to various fates. Robert Noyce became one of the most celebrated figures in technology history before dying suddenly of a heart attack in 1990 at the age of 62. Gordon Moore lived to see his name become synonymous with the relentless pace of technological progress, passing away in 2023 at 94. Eugene Kleiner built a venture capital empire that continues to fund new generations of entrepreneurs. The others scattered into various pursuits, their individual contributions often overshadowed by the collective achievement they had made possible. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, the two young men who met through a mutual friend and discovered a shared passion for electronics, would take divergent paths after Apple's early success. Wozniak eventually stepped back from the company to pursue other interests, including teaching elementary school students about technology. Jobs would leave Apple in 1985 amid conflicts with the board, return triumphantly in 1997, and guide the company to heights that would have seemed unimaginable in those early garage days. He died in 2011, mourned by millions who felt they had lost someone who had genuinely changed their lives. Xerox PARC continues to operate, though its role in the technology ecosystem has diminished from its glory days in the 1970s. The laboratory that invented so many fundamental technologies now functions more modestly, a reminder of what might have been if Xerox corporate leadership had possessed the vision to capitalize on its researchers' achievements. The Homebrew Computer Club held its last meeting in December 1986, having served its purpose of nurturing a community that had grown far beyond what any garage could contain. The hobbyist spirit that animated those early gatherings persists in makerspaces and hacker communities around the world, wherever people gather to share knowledge and help each other build things. And Silicon Valley itself continues to evolve. The companies that dominate the technology industry today would be unrecognizable to the engineers who attended those first Fairchild meetings or demonstrated their homebrew computers in Gordon French's garage. But the culture they created, the belief that small groups of determined people can change the world, endures. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider what it must have felt like to live through those years of transformation. Imagine driving down a California road in 1970, passing orchards that would soon give way to office parks. Imagine sitting in a cramped laboratory, staring at a circuit board, knowing that the work you were doing might change everything, but not quite able to see how. Imagine the excitement and the fear and the exhilaration of being present at the beginning of something unprecedented. The world we live in now, with computers in our pockets and information at our fingertips, grew from seeds planted in that quiet California valley. Every time you use a smartphone, or browse the internet, or work on a laptop, you are participating in a revolution that began with a handful of dreamers who refused to accept the world as it was and insisted on building the world as it could be. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If you enjoyed this journey through the early days of Silicon Valley, please do hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes it possible for us to keep bringing you these stories. Share this video with anyone you know who loves technology, history, or who might enjoy falling asleep to tales of innovation and ambition. Sleep well, dear friends. Dream of garages filled with possibilities, of orchards giving way to office parks, of young engineers gathered in parking lots to trade ideas and circuit boards. Dream of a time when the future was still being invented, one transistor at a time. And know that the revolution those dreamers started is still unfolding, still carrying us toward destinations we cannot yet imagine. Good night, and thank you for listening. Share artifacts. Download all Silicon Valley 70s full script document. ND Silicon Valley outline document. ND Silicon Valley 1970s full script document. ND Silicon Valley 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 full script created by you. Add PDFs, documents or other text to reference in this project.